Before we dive into this story, leave a comment and let us know what city you're watching from. And don't forget to rate the story from 0 to 10 at the end. Enjoy the story. The chandeliers of the Hawthorne estate dripped down from the dining room ceiling like frozen rain, each crystal catching the candlelight and throwing it back across the long mahogany table in restless little flickers. The room smelled of beeswax polish, old roses, and money that had been quietly compounding itself for 4 generations. Sienna Vale stood at the edge of the marble foyer, gripping the strap of her second-hand canvas bag so tightly that her knuckles had gone the color of bone, and wondered, for the 3rd time in 11 minutes, whether it was too late to turn around and pretend she had never come. Her father had told her to wait by the fountain. Her father had also told her that this dinner was a formality, that she should keep her head down, smile when spoken to, and absolutely under no circumstances make eye contact with anyone wearing cufflinks worth more than her rent. Sienna had agreed to all of it on the car ride over, mostly because arguing with Marcus Vale was like arguing with a brick wall that loved you. The wall would still love you back. It would also still be a wall. She tugged at the hem of her dress, a navy blue thing she had found at a consignment shop 2 days earlier, and which had seemed perfectly acceptable until she stepped through the front doors of the Hawthorne estate and realized that the housekeeper's uniform cost more than her entire wardrobe. Just another Friday in paradise. Sienna's reflection blinked back at her from a gilded mirror across the foyer, and she winced at what she saw. Her chestnut hair, which she had spent 45 minutes coaxing into something resembling elegance, had already begun to escape its pins in soft, rebellious wisps around her face. Her eyeliner was smudged from the humidity. A small coffee stain had appeared on her cuff during the cab ride over, an artifact of the to-go cup she had been clutching for moral support. She decided, like a girl who had wandered into the wrong fairy tale and was about to be politely escorted out by a footman. Miss Vale. The voice came from behind her, low and clipped and unmistakably trained, and Sienna's shoulders snapped to attention before she had consciously identified the speaker. She turned and found a tall man in a charcoal suit standing precisely 3 steps away, hands folded behind his back, his face arranged into the kind of professional neutrality that suggested he had seen everything and was paid not to comment on any of it. Mr. Hawthorne will see you in the dining room shortly. Your father has been delayed at the gatehouse and asks that you proceed without him. Sienna blinked. Delayed? A security matter, miss. He assures you it is routine. She nodded slowly, because nodding was the only response her body seemed capable of producing, and followed the man down a corridor that was longer than her entire apartment building. Oil paintings stared down at her from gilded frames, generations of Hawthorns with hard eyes and harder mouths, each one looking faintly disappointed in her shoes. Sienna kept her chin up anyway. Her father had spent 23 years protecting men like the one waiting for her at the end of this hallway, and she would be damned if she let a few dead aristocrats intimidate her. The dining room, when they reached it, was worse than the foyer. The table stretched for what felt like an entire city block, set for 12 but presently occupied by only 1. He sat at the far end, half in candlelight and half in shadow, a single sheet of paper in his hand, a glass of something amber resting beside his wrist. He did not look up when she entered. He did not look up when the footman cleared his throat. He looked up only when Sienna, who had been holding her breath for so long she had begun to see small purple spots, exhaled audibly and accidentally knocked her hip against the corner of a sideboard. The candlestick rattled. The footman flinched. The man at the end of the table lifted his eyes, and Sienna Vale forgot, for one entirely inconvenient second, how to be a person. Adrian Hawthorne was 34 years old, the sole heir of a shipping and pharmaceutical empire that had outlived 3 economic collapses and 2 world wars, and he had the kind of face that did not so much demand attention as quietly assume it. His hair was dark and combed back with a precision that suggested either obsession or a very expensive valet. His jaw could have been used as a straightedge. His eyes, which she had expected to be the cold steel gray of every billionaire she had ever read about in the tabloids her aunt left lying around the kitchen, were instead a startling, unguarded green. They landed on her and stayed there. Sienna swallowed. "Mr. Hawthorne, I'm sorry. The sideboard. I didn't mean." "Sit," he said. His voice was quieter than she had expected, and lower, and carried the faint, polished trace of a boarding school accent that had been deliberately worn down. "Please, before you injure the furniture or yourself." She sat. The chair was farther from him than she had hoped, and closer than she had feared, which is to say, it was placed exactly halfway down the absurd length of the table, an island of velvet upholstery marooned in a sea of polished wood. The footman vanished. A different person, a woman in a crisp white apron, appeared with a basket of bread and disappeared again before Sienna could thank her. Adrian Hawthorne folded his sheet of paper in half, then in half again, and set it deliberately beside his glass. He was still looking at her. He had not stopped looking at her. And Sienna, who had spent the last week telling herself that this dinner was a formality, that it was a thank you for her father's 23 years of loyal service, that it meant nothing and would change nothing, suddenly understood, with the cold clarity of a person watching a wave rise above her head, that she had walked into something she did not understand at all. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Sienna counted the candles on the table because counting was something her hands could do without her permission, and her hands needed an occupation that did not involve fidgeting with her napkin. 12 candles. 6 on each side, all of them lit, even though there were only 2 people in the room, which seemed to her like an extraordinary waste of beeswax, and which she filed away in the small, persistent corner of her brain that kept a running tally of rich people behaviors she did not understand. "You look like your father," Adrian Hawthorne said at last. Sienna's eyes snapped up. "I do not." It came out before she could stop it, sharper than she had intended, and she felt the heat rise in her cheeks immediately. She had spent the entire car ride rehearsing soft, polite, deferential responses to whatever this man might say to her, and the very first thing she said to his face was a contradiction. She wanted to crawl under the table. She wanted the table to be smaller, so she could reach it faster. She said, "I have my mother's eyes, and her nose, and her general everything. People always tell me that." He picked up his glass and turned it slowly in his fingers. "I wasn't speaking of features." Sienna frowned. "Then what were you speaking of?" "The way you walked into the room," he said, "like you'd already counted every exit, like you were prepared, if necessary, to break the candlestick over someone's head." He paused. "It's a very specific posture. Your father has it. I assumed it was professional. Now I'm not sure." Sienna did not know what to do with that. She did not know what to do with the fact that he had watched her walk into a room and noticed the way her hands moved. She did not know what to do with the unhurried green of his eyes, or the small private quirk at the corner of his mouth that suggested he was enjoying something she had not yet been told the rules of. So she did what she always did when she felt outmatched, which was to deflect with the truth. "I work nights at a diner on Vermont Avenue," she said. "Counting exits is just good practice." Adrian Hawthorne's mouth tilted further. "Is it? There was a man last March who tried to leave without paying for his pancakes. He had a steak knife in his jacket pocket. I noticed because the handle was sticking out. And what did you do?" "I gave him the pancakes," Sienna said, "for free. And then I called the police from the back office while he was still chewing." He laughed. It was a quiet laugh, almost startled, like a man who had not laughed at a dinner table in a very long time, and the sound of it did something unwelcome to Sienna's chest. She looked down at her water glass. She made herself remember every single thing her father had told her on the drive over. Keep your head down. Smile when spoken to. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to charm Mr. Hawthorne. He is not a man who responds well to being charmed. I owe your father a great deal, Adrian said after a moment, and his voice had changed, become more careful, more measured. 23 years is a long time to stand between a person and the things that might hurt him. He's very good at his job, Sienna said. He is. Adrian looked at the folded sheet of paper beside his glass. There was an incident last week. In Lisbon. You won't have heard about it. He prefers it that way. Sienna's stomach tightened. Is he all right? He's perfectly all right. So am I. Because of him. Which is, in part, why I asked you here tonight. She waited. He didn't continue. The first course arrived, carried in by 2 staff members so quiet that Sienna did not hear them until the bowls were already in front of her, a pale yellow soup with a single perfect curl of cream floating in the center. She picked up the wrong spoon. She knew immediately that she had picked up the wrong spoon, because Adrian Hawthorne picked up the smaller one beside it without comment, and she felt the heat climb her neck like ivy. She set hers down. She picked up the correct one. He did not smile. He did not look at her. He did not in any way indicate that he had noticed her mistake, and somehow that was worse than if he had laughed at her outright. I asked you here, he said quietly, stirring his soup with the precise, unhurried motion of a person who had been taught to do so before he could read, because your father is being threatened. Not him, specifically. His daughter. Sienna's spoon froze halfway to her mouth. What? 3 weeks ago, a piece of correspondence arrived at my Manhattan office. It was unsigned. It mentioned you by name, your address, your place of employment, and your shift schedule. It suggested, in language I will not repeat at a dinner table, that any continued loyalty between your father and myself would be answered with consequences in your direction. Sienna set the spoon down. The candlelight wavered in front of her eyes. Why are you telling me this? Because your father refused to, Adrian said. He thought he could handle it without your knowledge. I disagreed. I disagreed strongly. You are not a chess piece, Miss Vale. You are a person. And you have the right to know that there are people in this world who would prefer you not to be. She gripped the edge of the table. She could feel her pulse in her throat, in her wrists, in the place behind her left ear, where her grandmother had once told her she carried all her worry. Who? I don't know yet. I have people working on it. Until I do, I would like to ask you something, and I would like you to consider it carefully before you answer. She looked up. He was watching her again, and this time there was no quirk at the corner of his mouth, no candlelit amusement, no carefully measured distance. There was only the green of his eyes and the steady, terrifying focus of a man who had clearly already decided something and was now waiting, very patiently, to find out whether she would let him have it. I would like you to stay here, he said, at the estate, as my guest, until this matter is resolved. Sienna opened her mouth. She closed it again. She thought about her tiny apartment with its rattling radiator and the cat she had been illegally housing in defiance of her lease. She thought about her shifts at the diner, about her tips, about her rent. She thought about her father, somewhere down at the gatehouse, delayed, which she now understood to mean making absolutely certain no one followed his daughter through the gate. And she thought, also, about the green of Adrian Hawthorne's eyes, and the way he had not stopped looking at her since the moment she had walked into the room, and the fact that her father had spent the entire car ride telling her, with the firm, unmistakable urgency of a man who knew his own boss far too well, do not let him charm you. Sienna picked up the correct spoon. I'll need to bring my cat, she said. Adrian Hawthorne did not blink. He did not laugh. He did not, as Sienna had half expected, summon a staff member to politely escort the diner waitress out of his dining room. He simply tilted his head a quarter-inch to the left, as though she had said something interesting in a language he was still learning, and said, "Your cat. His name is Mr. Biscuit. He's 11 pounds, mostly orange, and he has a deep moral objection to closed doors. Also, he's technically not allowed in my apartment, so if I leave him there for more than a week, my landlord will throw him into the street, and I will be forced to commit a crime." "Mr. Biscuit," Adrian repeated, as though tasting the name. "Yes. Will be welcome." Sienna let out a small breath she had not realized she was holding. "Thank you." "There is a sunroom on the east side of the main house," he said. "It receives direct light from approximately 7 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. The previous owner kept 3 Persians there. I believe Mr. Biscuit will find the accommodations acceptable." Sienna stared at him. "You know which rooms of your house get direct sunlight. I had a very thorough inspection done when I purchased the estate. I prefer to know the buildings I live in." She did not know what to do with that, either. She did not know what to do with a man who could quote the sunlight schedule of his own east sunroom, but who also, very clearly, did not know how to talk to a woman at a dinner table without making her feel as though she had been laid open under a microscope. She returned to her soup, which had, to her great relief, not yet gone cold. They ate in silence for several minutes. The silence was not uncomfortable, which Sienna found alarming. She had expected, walking into this house, that every silence between herself and Adrian Hawthorne would feel like an oncoming train. Instead, the silence felt like a window had been left open in a warm room, the air moving gently, neither one of them in any particular hurry to close it. "May I ask you something?" she said at last. "You may. Why didn't you just tell my father to send me out of the city? To my aunt's place, or to a hotel, or, I don't know, to literally anywhere that isn't your house?" Adrian set down his spoon. He took a slow sip of water. He looked at her with the careful, measured patience of a man choosing which truth to offer first. "Because your father has been my closest associate for 23 years, he said, and I have watched him make exactly one mistake in all that time. He underestimates the lengths to which the people who hate me will go. He thinks distance is protection. I know better. The only place in this country where I am absolutely certain no harm can come to you is inside the walls of this estate, with my own security on the perimeter, my own staff inside the house, and myself, personally within shouting distance." He paused. Also, I would prefer to know you are safe," he said, "where I can see you." Sienna's hand went still around her spoon. The candlelight wavered. She could feel her cheeks going warm again, and she hated it, and she could not stop it, and she wished very briefly and very fiercely that her father had warned her about this particular sentence and not just about the general concept of being charmed. "That's a very," she said, and stopped. "That's a very what?" "I'm not sure yet." His mouth tilted again at the corner. "Take your time." The second course arrived. A small fillet of fish that Sienna could not identify, served over something green and braised. She watched Adrian out of the corner of her eye, copied which fork he used, and made it through the next 20 minutes without further humiliation. He asked her about the diner. He asked her about her mother, who had died when Sienna was 16, and he asked it gently, the way a person asks who has lost someone of his own. He asked her about her studies, which she had abandoned in her second year of community college because the tuition had become impossible. He did not, she noticed, ask her about her father. He did not ask whether her father had ever spoken of him, what her father said about him, what kind of man her father believed him to be. She wondered if he was afraid of the answer, or if he simply already knew. "Tell me something," Adrian said as the plates were cleared. "Something true that no one in this house knows about you yet. Sienna laughed before she could stop herself. That's a very strange request. I am a very strange man. I'm beginning to notice. She thought about it. She thought about the things people usually wanted to hear about her, which were her mother, and her father, and the diner, and her small, careful ambitions, and her smaller, more careful disappointments. None of those were what he was asking for, and she knew it. I once, she said slowly, wrote a children's book. Adrian's eyebrows lifted. Did you publish it? Of course not. I was 19. I wrote it in a single weekend in my dorm room, on the back of a stack of old printer paper that someone had thrown away. It was called The Lighthouse Cat. It was about a cat who lived in a lighthouse with an old man, and every night he would climb up to the top of the tower and watch the ships go by, and he would invent a story about every single sailor he could not save. Sienna paused. She had not told anyone about this in 8 years. She did not know why she was telling him now. I cried when I finished it. I cried for 2 hours. I cried so hard my roommate thought someone had died. And then I put the manuscript in a shoebox under my bed, and I never touched it again. Adrian was very still. Why? Because, she said, I was 19, and I was afraid that if I showed it to anyone, they would tell me it wasn't very good. And then I would have to know it wasn't very good. And then I would have to stop. He watched her for a long moment. The candles flickered. Outside, somewhere in the dark beyond the tall windows, a nightbird called, a soft, repeating 2-note sound that Sienna found, against her will, deeply soothing. I would like to read it, Adrian said. Sienna laughed again, helplessly. Mr. Hawthorne. Adrian. I haven't looked at that manuscript in 8 years. It's probably been eaten by silverfish. It's almost certainly terrible. I would like to read it anyway. He paused. Not tonight. When you've forgiven yourself enough to let me. Sienna looked down at her plate. She blinked very fast for several seconds. She had not, until this moment, understood that there was a version of herself she had been refusing to forgive, and the fact that a complete stranger had been able to name it from across a dinner table felt less like an act of charm and more like an act of trespass. She did not know whether to thank him or to leave. She did not leave. Instead, she picked up her water glass, and she said, very carefully, I'll think about it. Adrian inclined his head, and the conversation moved on, the way conversations did in rooms like this, smoothly, expertly, as though the previous 5 minutes had not happened at all. But Sienna noticed, even as she answered his next question, even as she laughed at his next dry observation about the absurdity of his own art collection, that Adrian Hawthorne had not looked away from her once. Not when the staff entered. Not when his phone, lying screened down beside his glass, lit up and vibrated quietly against the wood. Not when, somewhere down the long corridor, the front door opened, and her father's familiar, careful footsteps began to approach. Adrian Hawthorne could not stop staring at her across the dinner table, and Sienna Vale, who had been raised by a bodyguard to notice exactly this kind of detail, was going to have to figure out, very quickly, what on earth she was going to do about it. Marcus Vale entered the dining room with the same unhurried, deliberate stride Sienna had known since she was 4 years old. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with cropped iron-gray hair and a face that had been weathered into permanent watchfulness. He nodded to Adrian first, because protocol required it, and then to Sienna, because love required it, and the order of those 2 nods had been the architecture of her entire childhood. "Apologies for the delay, sir," he said. "There was a vehicle parked across from the south gate. It moved on after a conversation." Adrian set down his glass. "Anyone we know? Not yet. Plates? Stolen this morning from a long-term lot in Newark. The vehicle will be in a scrapyard by dawn. The driver is being followed." Adrian nodded once. "Thank you, Marcus. Sir." Sienna watched her father's eyes flick just once to her face. He was reading her. He was checking for damage. He was looking for the specific small signals he had taught her to give him, since she was old enough to understand them, that would tell him whether she was upset, frightened, angry, or fine. She gave him fine. She did it on purpose. She did it because she knew the moment she gave him upset, the entire evening would end, and she would be put into a car and driven home and locked inside her own apartment for her own safety, and she was not, she had just discovered, ready for the evening to end. Marcus held her gaze for one beat longer than was strictly necessary, and Sienna understood that he had noticed her, noticing. Of course he had noticed. He had been a bodyguard for 23 years, and her father for 26. There was nothing about her face he had not memorized. "I'll be at the gatehouse, sir," he said. "If you need me." "Stay," Adrian said. Marcus paused. "Sir? Stay. Sit. Eat. You have been on your feet since 5 this morning." Adrian gestured to the empty chair across from Sienna. "Your daughter has agreed to remain at the estate until further notice. We should discuss the arrangements." Sienna watched something pass behind her father's face. It was very small and very fast, and almost entirely invisible to anyone who had not spent 2.5 decades learning to read him, but it was there. And it was not relief. It was something closer to "I knew this was going to happen, and I had hoped that I was wrong." He sat. He sat the way he did everything. With control. He did not pick up the wrong fork. He did not knock over the candlestick. He looked, in his black uniform jacket and his immaculate posture, as though he had been born to dine in this room, which Sienna found grimly unfair, because if anyone in the world had earned the right to look intimidated by 12 unnecessary candles, it was the man who had stood between bullets and her childhood for 26 years. "Sienna," Marcus said quietly. "Yes." "Did Mr. Hawthorne tell you?" "About the letter." Sienna kept her voice steady. "Yes. He told me." Marcus exhaled, slowly through his nose. "I had asked him not to." "I know. I had reasons." "I know that too, Dad." Marcus looked down at his plate. The staff had already placed a setting for him without being asked. Sienna had not seen them do it. She wondered, briefly, how many years it took for a household staff to learn to anticipate a man like Adrian Hawthorne, and whether they were paid enough for the trouble. "I don't like this," Marcus said, to no one in particular. "I am aware," said Adrian. "I don't like her being inside the perimeter. I don't like her being on the property. I don't like her being on a schedule that anyone, anywhere can predict, which is precisely why," Adrian said, "she will not be on any schedule that anyone, anywhere can predict. She will be inside the estate. She will move through the estate at irregular intervals. She will be accompanied at all times by either yourself or by one of the 3 people I trust to do the job. And she will, when this matter is resolved, walk back out the front door with no permanent attachment to this house, and no permanent attachment to me, if that is what she chooses." There was a very specific weight on the last 7 words. "No permanent attachment to me, if that is what she chooses." Sienna looked at her napkin. Her father looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at Sienna. And the candles, which were now beginning to drip down the sides of their silver holders in slow, fat tears of wax, did not flinch. "I will need to bring her cat," Marcus said. Sienna laughed. She did not mean to. It bubbled up out of her chest like something carbonated. And she pressed her napkin to her mouth to stop it, and both men looked at her with the polite alarm of men who did not know whether they had just told a joke. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "It's just. The cat is the first thing both of you have agreed on." Adrian Hawthorne smiled. It was a real smile this time, not a tilt at the corner of the mouth, not a careful, measured thing. It was a smile that reached his eyes, and Sienna saw, with the dim and dawning horror of a woman who had been raised to know better, that she was in a great deal of trouble. Marcus, who had been her father long enough to recognize a great deal of trouble when it appeared at his daughter's dinner table, set down his water glass with quiet finality. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said. "Marcus, may I have a word with you, in private, after the meal?" "Of course. Thank you." Sienna looked between the two of them. "Should I be worried?" "No," said her father. "Yes," said Adrian, at exactly the same moment. Sienna picked up her wine glass, which she had not yet touched, and took a long, slow sip. The wine tasted like something a person could afford only once in a lifetime, which she suspected was probably accurate. She set the glass back down. She squared her shoulders. She looked at the man at the end of the table, who was, against every instruction her father had ever given her, looking right back. "Adrian," she said, and his eyes sharpened on her name. "If I'm going to stay in your house, I have 3 conditions." His mouth tilted. "I'm listening. First, I want a key to whatever door you actually use. Not the front door. The real one. The one your staff uses when they don't want to be seen. If something happens, I am not going to stand in a grand foyer waiting for someone to open a door for me." Marcus made a small sound that was almost approval. "Second," Sienna said, "I am not a guest. I am not a damsel. I will earn my keep. There must be something in this house that needs doing. Cataloging, archiving, organizing the library. I have hands. Use them." Adrian inclined his head. "And the third?" "The third," she said, "is that you will stop staring at me like I'm a question you forgot the answer to. It's distracting. And my father is sitting right there. Marcus Vale, 26 years a father, 23 years a bodyguard, and approximately 3 seconds away from putting his head in his hands, slowly closed his eyes." Adrian Hawthorne, for the first time all evening, did not have an answer ready. The remainder of dinner passed in something that resembled, if you squinted at it from a great distance, polite conversation. Marcus answered questions about the South Gate. Adrian asked questions about the South Gate. Sienna ate her fish, which she eventually identified as turbot, because Adrian mentioned it in passing in the way a person mentions weather. She did not ask any more questions. She had asked enough questions for one evening. She was full, in fact, of questions she had not asked. "Why did you wait until the second course to tell me my life was in danger? Why did you choose to tell me at all? Why are you looking at me like that? Why does my father look like a man watching a slow accident in a mirror? Why is the candlelight catching your eyes the way it is? Why am I noticing the candlelight catching your eyes? Why is the breadbasket so warm? Why does this entire house smell like roses when it is October? Why, when you said the words 'no permanent attachment' to me, if that is what she chooses, did the words 'if' and 'she' and 'chooses' sound so carefully placed, like stones in a riverbed laid down by someone who knew exactly where she would step? She did not ask any of them. She ate her dessert, which was a small custard topped with caramelized sugar that cracked under her spoon like a thin sheet of ice on a puddle, and she made small, polite, controlled conversation with both men, and she watched the candles burn down by half an inch, and she counted, in the small persistent corner of her brain that kept track of these things, every single time Adrian Hawthorne's eyes returned to her face. The total, by the time the staff had cleared the dessert plates, was 42. 42 times in one meal. Sienna was going to have to find a way to live in this house for an indefinite period of time, and she was going to have to do it while being looked at, on average, every 90 seconds, by a man who had clearly decided something about her that he had not yet shared with her, her father, or possibly himself. When the meal ended, Marcus stood. Adrian stood. Sienna stood. Adrian asked the housekeeper, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Patel, whom Sienna had not yet been introduced to, and who somehow already knew her name, to show Sienna to the rooms that had been prepared for her. Sienna kissed her father on the cheek, which he allowed, and she pretended not to see the look he exchanged with Adrian on her way out of the dining room. The look said many things. It said, among them, I trust you with my life, and I have always trusted you with my life, and I am not certain, any more, that I trust you with hers. Mrs. Patel led Sienna up a staircase wide enough to accommodate a small parade and down a corridor lined with more disapproving oil portraits, and she did not speak until they had reached a set of double doors at the very end of the east wing. Miss Vale, she said, pushing the doors open. Your rooms. Sienna stepped through. She stopped. She stepped back. She stepped through again. The sitting room alone was larger than her apartment. The fireplace was already lit, low and golden, and a small fire was crackling in it as though it had been waiting for her, which she supposed, in this house, it probably had. A vase of fresh white roses sat on the side table, a book she had mentioned, exactly once, in a conversation with her father 6 months ago, sat on the nightstand of the bedroom beyond. A wing-back chair near the fire held a folded cashmere throw that exactly matched the color of her favorite sweater, which she had been wearing the first time she had ever shaken Adrian Hawthorne's hand 3 years ago at her father's modest 60th birthday party. Sienna sat down on the edge of the bed. She put her face in her hands. She made a small, hysterical sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite a sob, and not quite a curse. Miss Vale, said Mrs. Patel. Mr. Hawthorne asked me to convey a message. Sienna lifted her head. Of course he did. Mrs. Patel's mouth, which Sienna would later come to learn rarely moved, tilted upward by approximately 2 millimeters. He says that the east sunroom will be ready for Mr. Biscuit by tomorrow afternoon. He says that the back staircase, which the staff use, opens onto the kitchen garden, and that you may have a key in the morning. He says that the library is yours, with his compliments, and that he has left a list of cataloging tasks on the desk should you wish to inspect them. And he says. Mrs. Patel paused, very briefly, as though she were translating from a slightly difficult language. He says that he will endeavor, in future, to confine his staring to moments when your father is not in the room. Sienna stared at her. Mrs. Patel inclined her head with the precise, perfect dignity of a woman who had not been hired to comment on her employer's private life, and who was commenting on it anyway. Good night, Miss Vale. Good night, Mrs. Patel. The doors closed. Sienna stayed exactly where she was, on the edge of the bed, in the middle of a sitting room that was bigger than her apartment, in a house that was older than her country, with a fire crackling in a hearth she had not lit, and a vase of white roses she had not requested, and a book she had only ever mentioned once. She did not, in any sense she would later be able to articulate, sleep that night. She lay awake under a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and watched the firelight move across the ceiling, and she thought about the way Adrian Hawthorne had said, I would prefer to know you are safe where I can see you, and she thought about the way her father had said, on the drive over, do not let him charm you, and she thought about the lighthouse cat in its shoebox under her bed in her apartment 14 miles away, and she thought somewhere around 3 in the morning that her father had been entirely right, and that she had nevertheless already completely, and probably irrevocably, failed him. Morning at the Hawthorne estate did not so much arrive as quietly clear its throat. The sun came up over the eastern hills in a wash of pale gold, and Sienna, who had been awake since approximately 5:45, watched it crawl across the ceiling of an unfamiliar bedroom from underneath a quilt she had never paid for. She had decided, somewhere in the small hours, that she would treat this entire situation the way she had treated every other strange situation life had handed her, which was to find a job inside it as quickly as possible. Idle hands and a wandering mind were a luxury Sienna Vale had never been able to afford, and she was not about to begin practicing them now, in the east wing of a house full of disapproving oil portraits and one alarmingly handsome billionaire. She got out of bed. She dressed in the only practical outfit she had packed, which was a pair of dark jeans, a soft gray sweater, and the kind of low boots that would not embarrass her on a marble floor. She found, when she opened the wardrobe out of curiosity, that someone had already, sometime during the night, hung a collection of clothing in her approximate size along one rail. She closed the wardrobe with the gentle horror of a woman who was beginning to understand that this house anticipated her needs faster than she could form them. She found the back staircase exactly where Mrs. Patel had told her it would be. She found the kitchen at the bottom of it, which was a vast, copper-bottomed, slate-floored cathedral of a room, and she found, sitting on a stool at the long center island, with a cup of black coffee in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other, Adrian Hawthorne. He was wearing a soft, dark sweater. His hair was not yet combed back. His feet were bare. He looked up, and for the briefest possible instant his face did something it had not done at any point during the previous evening, which was to register surprise. He recovered almost immediately. Miss Vale, Sienna, who had not been expecting to encounter the master of the house in his own kitchen at 6:15 in the morning, did her best not to register surprise back. Mr. Hawthorne. Adrian. You're up early. I'm always up early. I work nights at a diner, remember? She crossed to the coffee pot, because she needed something to do with her hands, and because the smell of the coffee was, frankly, beginning to undo her. May I? Please. She poured a cup. She added nothing to it. She turned around and leaned against the counter, because she did not yet feel brave enough to sit at the island with him, and she was not going to admit that, even to herself. You should know, she said, that I take my cataloging task very seriously. I am going to need a list, an inventory, and access to whatever filing system already exists. I am also going to need to know your acquisition history if any of these books were purchased at auction in the last 20 years. And I am going to need someone to tell me whether you actually want a catalog, or whether you are simply giving me something to do so that I don't feel like a charity case. Adrian set down his newspaper. I want a catalog. Genuinely? Genuinely. The library has not been touched, in any organized sense, since approximately 1947. My grandmother attempted it twice, and was defeated both times. My father considered it a waste of his time. I would very much like to know what is in my own house. Sienna nodded slowly. Then, you have a librarian, temporary, unqualified, and approximately as expensive as your second most affordable bottle of wine. We'll start at 9. 8:30? 9. His mouth tilted. 9 it is. They drank their coffee in silence. The silence was, like the silence at dinner the night before, alarmingly comfortable, as though the kitchen were a room they had stood in together 1,000 times before, and Sienna was beginning to suspect that comfort with this man was going to be the most dangerous thing about him. Adrian. May I ask why you came down to the kitchen yourself? He looked at his coffee cup. He turned it once in his fingers. I came down to make sure the staff had what they needed to receive your cat. Sienna stared at him. Mr. Biscuit isn't even here yet. He will be by 10. Your father is collecting him on his way back from the city, and you came to the kitchen at 6:15 to make sure the staff had what they needed to receive my cat. Yes. Adrian. Sienna. You are a billionaire. You have a household staff of 23 people. You have a personal assistant who has, I am told, 3 personal assistants of her own. There is no logical reason for you to be standing in your own kitchen, in bare feet, at 6:15 in the morning, micromanaging the welcome arrangements for an 11-pound orange cat. Adrian Hawthorne looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. He did not speak for a long moment. Sienna. Yes, I am aware. Sienna, who had until that moment believed she had a fairly firm grasp on the situation, suddenly felt the floor of the situation tilt approximately 3 degrees beneath her boots. She set down her coffee cup, very carefully, because she did not trust her hands. She looked out of the kitchen window, where the sun was now turning the edges of the hills a soft, ordinary pink, and she made herself breathe. "We should talk about that," she said. "We should. But not now. No. After the library. After the library." She picked up her cup again. The coffee was still hot. She drank it. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She could feel him not looking at her, which was, somehow, worse because it required just as much effort, and they both knew it. By the time her father arrived at the front gate with Mr. Biscuit in a battered cardboard carrier, Sienna had already finished a second cup of coffee, drawn up a preliminary work plan, and made 3 quiet, private decisions about Adrian Hawthorne. She decided first that her father had been right about everything. She decided second that being right about everything had not, in this case, been quite enough. And she decided, third, with the unhappy clarity of a woman who had spent her entire life understanding the cost of every door she walked through, that she was going to have to be very, very careful about which doors, in this house, she allowed herself to open. The library, when she finally saw it at 9 a.m. sharp, took her breath away in the literal, embarrassing hand-to-the-chest sense. It occupied the entire north wing of the ground floor, 2 stories tall, with a wrought iron spiral staircase in the corner, leaded glass windows along the upper gallery, and an honest-to-God ladder on rails that ran the length of the lower shelves. The smell of the room was the smell of every library Sienna had ever loved, magnified by a factor of approximately 10,000. Old paper. Cracked leather. Beeswax, a faint, almost imperceptible note of pipe tobacco that had probably been settling into the rug since the 1920s. She stood in the doorway for a full 30 seconds without moving. "I'm going to need," she said, when she could finally speak, "an apron, a pencil, 6 legal pads, a stepladder, 2 pairs of cotton gloves, a tape measure, an empty spreadsheet, a flashlight, and approximately the rest of my natural life." "I'll have someone bring the supplies," said Adrian, from somewhere behind her left shoulder. "The natural life I'll leave to your discretion." Sienna laughed. She had not meant to. She did not know any more how to stop laughing in this house. By 11 o'clock she had her supplies, her stepladder, her gloves, and a system. By noon she had cataloged the first shelf. By 2 she had identified 3 first editions, one of which was a presentation copy from a Nobel laureate to Adrian's great-grandfather, with a handwritten inscription that began to Cornelius, with whom I have argued for 16 years, and to whom I have lost every argument. By 4 she had developed a small, embarrassing fondness for Cornelius Hawthorne. By 6 she had developed a small, embarrassing fondness for the room itself. Adrian appeared in the library doorway at 6:15, leaning one shoulder against the frame. "Mrs. Patel says you have not stopped working for 9 hours. Mrs. Patel exaggerates. Mrs. Patel does not exaggerate. Ever. About anything. It is one of her many alarming qualities." Sienna climbed down from the stepladder. Her hair had escaped its tie an hour ago. Her hands were dusty. She was certain there was a smudge of something on her cheek, because she could feel where she had wiped a damp wrist across her face, and she had stopped caring about it approximately 3 shelves ago. I lost track. I noticed. Did Mr. Biscuit settle in? Mr. Biscuit settled into the east sunroom at 11:30, ate an entire plate of cooked salmon at 12:15, attempted to take down a curtain at 1, and is now asleep on a cashmere throw I had been intending to use for myself this winter. So yes. Sienna laughed again. He likes you. He tolerates me. There is a meaningful difference. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the man in the doorway, who was, for reasons she had not yet fully accepted, still standing there, leaning against the frame, watching her with the patient, unhurried attention he had directed at her over candlelight 24 hours earlier, and had apparently never stopped directing at her since. Adrian. Sienna. We were going to talk. We were. After the library. After the library. It is now after the library. He pushed off the doorframe. He came into the room. He stopped at the long oak table where she had stacked her notebooks, and he picked up the topmost one, and he turned it over once in his hands without opening it. "Walk with me." She washed her hands at the small sink in the corner. She left her apron folded over the back of a chair. She followed him out of the library, through a side door she had not previously noticed, down a short corridor, and through a set of French doors into a walled garden she had also not previously noticed. The light was beginning to soften toward evening. Late roses bloomed along the back wall in stubborn, defiant clusters. A stone bench sat under an arch of climbing jasmine. Adrian gestured to the bench. Sienna sat. He did not sit beside her. He stood, instead, 3 steps away, hands in his pockets, looking out at the wall, as though he were addressing it rather than her, which she suspected was a deliberate kindness, because she was not certain she could have survived being looked at directly for what came next. "I owe you," he said, an explanation. "Several, in fact. I am going to attempt to give them to you in the order in which they will be least painful to receive." Sienna folded her hands in her lap. "All right. 3 years ago, your father invited me to his 60th birthday party. I went because Marcus is the closest thing I have to family, and I would have gone if he had invited me to a dentist's appointment. You were there. You wore a soft gray sweater. You spent most of the evening in the kitchen, refilling people's plates and refusing to sit down. When I shook your hand, you told me I looked tired and asked me when I had last eaten a green vegetable." Sienna stared at the climbing jasmine. She did not remember asking him that. She remembered the party. She remembered shaking his hand. She did not remember the sentence. "I went home that night," Adrian said, "and I sat in my study and I thought about that sentence for a very long time. I had not been asked, by anyone other than my doctor, when I had last eaten a green vegetable in approximately 15 years. It seemed, on reflection, like an unusual thing to be asked by a stranger." He paused. "I also thought," he said, "about the soft gray sweater." Sienna closed her eyes. "Adrian, I did not act on it. I am not, despite considerable evidence to the contrary, an idiot. You were the daughter of my closest associate. You were a great deal younger than I was. We had nothing in common except, perhaps, an opinion about my green vegetable intake. I had no business thinking about you, and I had even less business doing anything about it, and I did neither." He paused, until the letter arrived. Sienna opened her eyes. "The letter. When the letter arrived," he said, "and I read your name on it, and your address, and your shift schedule, and the things that the person who wrote it intended to do to you, I discovered something about myself that I had been doing a fairly elegant job of not discovering for 3 years." He still did not look at her. He was, she suspected, doing it on purpose. He was giving her the dignity of not having to arrange her face. "I am telling you this," he said, "because you asked me last night to stop staring at you across the dinner table, and you deserved a real answer, and you deserved it from across a garden, in soft light, without your father in the room. So." He looked at her. Finally. "So." Sienna sat very still on the stone bench. The jasmine moved a little in the breeze. The light was soft. The wall was old. The roses were stubborn. She wondered, briefly, whether the people who had built this garden had imagined, on some evening 400 years ago, that a billionaire would one day stand in it and explain himself to a diner waitress in a soft gray sweater, and she decided that they had probably not, and that the garden had grown into the moment anyway, the way gardens did. She drew in a slow breath. "Adrian." "Yes, if you want me to stop being staff in this house," she said carefully, "you should know that I am not going to. The cataloging is real. The work is real. I am earning my keep, and I am going to continue to earn my keep, and I am not going to let you turn me into a guest in a wing of your house because of a sentence I said 3 years ago that I do not even remember saying. I would not dream of it. Good. However, if you want me to stop staring at you across the dinner table, he said, you are going to have to give me a very different instruction than the one you gave me last night, and you are going to have to give it to me when you mean it, and I will obey it, Sienna. I will obey it the moment you mean it. She looked at her hands. She looked at the jasmine. She looked at the man standing 3 steps away from her, who had not moved any closer, and who would not, she understood with a strange, calm certainty, ever move closer unless she invited him to. I don't know what I mean yet, she said. I know. I'm not going to know tonight. I know that, too. But I'm not asking you to stop. Adrian Hawthorne, billionaire, heir, employer of her father, owner of the bench she was sitting on, the wall she was looking at, and the garden that smelled of late roses, closed his eyes for a moment. Thank you, he said quietly, and then he turned, and he walked back into the house, and he left her there alone with the jasmine and the soft fading light, because he was, against every expectation she had carried into this estate, an extraordinary kind of careful man. The next 11 days passed in a rhythm Sienna would not have believed possible if she had been told about it in advance. She woke at 6. She drank black coffee in the copper-bottomed kitchen, sometimes alone, sometimes with Adrian, sometimes with her father, who had taken to appearing at the island in his uniform jacket and quietly reading the security report aloud to whichever of them was awake. She worked in the library from 9 to 6, with a break for lunch that Mrs. Patel insisted on serving her in the conservatory, on a small table by a tall window, with a cloth napkin and a pot of tea and a single fresh flower that changed every day. She catalogued 1,863 books. She identified 7 more first editions. She found a pressed flower from 1894 between the pages of a French novel, and she found a child's drawing of a horse from somewhere in the 1920s tucked into a German philosophy text, and she found a love letter from 1953 hidden inside a copy of Plutarch that no one in the house, when she asked, was able to identify. She also found in herself a person she had not met before. She had not realized, until she stopped working 2 jobs and sleeping 4 hours a night, that she had been very tired for a very long time. She had not realized, until she stopped counting tips and worrying about rent, that her hands shook a little, in the mornings, until the first cup of coffee. She had not realized, until she had had 11 consecutive nights of uninterrupted sleep under a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender, that her shoulders had been somewhere up around her ears for approximately 4 years. She had also not realized, until she began having dinner with Adrian Hawthorne every single evening at 7 o'clock sharp, that there was a particular kind of loneliness that did not announce itself until the moment it began, for the first time, to lift. They did not talk about the garden. They did not talk about the lighthouse cat. They did not talk about the soft gray sweater, or the sentence about the green vegetables, or the way his eyes followed her across the dinner table, although she noticed, in the small, persistent corner of her brain that kept track of these things, that the count had dropped from 40 2 times per meal on the first night to a slow, steady, careful 11 or 12. She suspected, very strongly, that he was rationing himself. She suspected, even more strongly, that he was doing it for her. They talked, instead, about books. They talked about Cornelius Hawthorne, who had, it turned out, been an enthusiastic if very bad amateur poet, and whose unpublished sonnet Sienna had unearthed in a battered file in the back of the library closet on day 6. They talked about Mr. Biscuit, who had developed a rivalry with one of the kitchen tabby cats and was currently winning. They talked about Mrs. Patel, whom Sienna was beginning to suspect of being a very dignified and undercover comedian. They talked, sometimes, about the letter that had brought her into the house, the threat that no one had yet been able to trace, the slow, careful work that her father and Adrian's security team were doing in rooms Sienna was politely not invited into. She did not press. She did not ask. She had grown up in a house with a man who carried other people's secrets for a living, and she knew, without having to be told, that there were doors in this house that would not open until they were ready to. On the 12th night, one of the doors opened. It opened at 3:47 in the morning, with a knock so soft that Sienna almost did not hear it through her sleep. She sat up. She pulled on a sweater over her pajamas. She crossed the dark sitting room in bare feet and opened the door, and her father was standing there, fully dressed, his uniform jacket buttoned, a small black radio earpiece in one ear, and an expression on his face she had not seen since she was 9 years old, and the windows of their old apartment had been broken in the middle of the night. "Get dressed," he said. "Dad." "Now, Sienna." She got dressed. She did it fast. She put on the dark jeans, the soft gray sweater, the low boots. She did not ask questions, because her father did not respond well to questions during the kind of moments that involved black radio earpieces. She followed him down the back staircase, through the kitchen, through a door she had not previously seen, down a short flight of stone steps, and into a small, low-ceilinged room beneath the house that she had no idea existed. Adrian was already there. He was wearing the same dark sweater he had been wearing in the kitchen on her first morning. His hair was not combed back. His feet were not bare, but only just. 3 other people were in the room with him, 2 men and a woman, all in dark clothing, all with the same trained neutrality Sienna had first seen on the footman at the dining room door. None of them looked at her with anything like surprise. They had been expecting her. Sienna. Adrian crossed to her. He did not touch her. He stopped exactly 1 step away, which was, she had come to understand, his particular form of restraint. "There has been a development. I would like to tell you about it before you hear it from anyone else." "Tell me." "The person who wrote the letter," he said quietly, "has been identified. He is currently in a vehicle approximately 40 miles from this estate. He is being followed by 3 teams. He is not going to reach the property. He is not going to reach any property on which you have ever stood. He is, in the next 4 hours, going to be in police custody." Sienna's knees did something briefly unsupportive. She put her hand on the back of a chair. Then in the morning, Adrian said, "Your father is going to drive you back to your apartment. The threat will be resolved. The watch will be lifted. You will be free, Sienna, to go back to your life. To your diner. To your apartment. To your landlord, who will continue to harass you about your cat. To your shifts. To your tips. To everything you were doing the night before we sat down to dinner at the long table." He paused. "I wanted to tell you myself. Because I wanted you to know before anyone else told you that the door I held open for you on the first night is now exactly as wide as it ever was. You may walk back through it whenever you wish. There will be no resistance. There will be no inconvenience. You will not be asked any questions. You will not be asked to look back." Sienna stared at him. The room was very quiet. The 2 men and the woman were looking, with great and deliberate intensity, at various unrelated portions of the wall. Her father was standing very, very still beside her. "Adrian." "Yes." "Are you offering me the choice to leave?" she said. "Or are you asking me to make it?" Adrian Hawthorne, billionaire, heir, employer of her father, owner of the chair her hand was resting on, the room she was standing in, and the estate that had, somewhere along the way and entirely without her permission, become the first place in her adult life where she had slept 11 nights in a row without dreaming of unpaid bills, looked at her with the steady, terrifying focus of a man who had clearly already decided something, and was now waiting, very patiently, to find out whether she would let him have it. "I am offering you," he said quietly, "the choice. I am not, and I will not, ask you to make it. You will make it on your own, Sienna. You will make it without me in the room, and whatever you decide, I will respect it the moment you tell me." He stepped back. He nodded once to Marcus. He turned. He left the room. Sienna stood there in the dim light, in the low-ceilinged room beneath the house she had not known existed, with her father beside her and her hand on the back of a chair, and her heart somewhere up around her ears. And she understood, with the dim and dawning clarity of a woman who had spent her entire life understanding the cost of every door she walked through, that the most important door of her life had just been opened, and that the only person who could decide whether to walk through it was her. She did not sleep again that night. She went back to her rooms. She sat by the fire, which someone had quietly stoked while she had been downstairs, because of course someone had. She watched the flames move. Mr. Biscuit padded out of the bedroom, jumped up onto the wingback chair beside her, turned around twice, and went back to sleep on the cashmere throw with the absolute confidence of a cat who had identified the best seat in the house and intended to defend it with his life. Sienna thought about her apartment. She thought about her rattling radiator, which had gotten worse over the winter, and would, by next year, almost certainly need to be replaced by someone who would charge her money she did not have. She thought about her landlord, who had begun, in the last 3 months, to leave her notes about her cat. She thought about her 2 double shifts a week at the diner. She thought about the man who had tried to walk out without paying for his pancakes, and the steak knife in his jacket pocket, and the fact that she had been 23 years old when it happened, and that she had handled it alone, and that no one in her life, on that night or any night since, had been close enough to her to know it had happened at all. She thought about Adrian Hawthorne. She thought about the way he had not stopped looking at her across the dinner table, and the way he had not moved closer in the garden, and the way he had said, "I am offering you the choice. I am not, and I will not, ask you to make it." She thought about her father, who had spent 26 years standing between her and the things that might hurt her, and who had spent 23 of those years standing beside Adrian Hawthorne, and who had told her, on the car ride over, "Do not let him charm you," and who had nevertheless agreed to bring her cat into Adrian's house at 6:15 in the morning. She thought about the lighthouse cat in its shoebox under her bed in her apartment 14 miles away, and she thought about the man she had told about it, who had said, "I would like to read it." "Not tonight. When you've forgiven yourself enough to let me." She thought, somewhere around 5 in the morning, that she had been waiting her entire adult life for someone to ask the right question, and that someone, against every reasonable expectation she had ever held about her own life, had finally asked it. The sun came up. The east sunroom turned gold. Mr. Biscuit yawned, stretched, and went to demand his breakfast. Sienna got up. She washed her face. She put on the dark jeans, the soft gray sweater, the low boots. She went down the back staircase. She did not go to the kitchen. She went, instead, to the library. She walked across the long room, past the wrought iron staircase, past the leaded glass windows, past the 1,863 books she had catalogued, and she stopped at the long oak table where she had stacked her notebooks. She picked up a pencil. She picked up a fresh legal pad. She wrote, at the top of it, in her careful, deliberate hand, Hawthorne Family Library. Catalog Project. Phase 2, to include conservatory bookshelves, study, north sitting room, Cornelius Hawthorne's unpublished sonnets, estimated duration, 4 to 6 months. Catalog librarian, S. Vale. She set the pencil down. She turned around. Adrian Hawthorne was standing in the doorway of the library. He had clearly been standing there for some time. He was wearing the soft dark sweater. His hair was not combed back. His feet were bare. He looked, in the long, pale morning light coming through the leaded glass, like a man who had been awake all night for reasons he was not going to discuss in this lifetime. Sienna. Adrian. She held up the legal pad. Phase 2. He did not move. He did not, in fact, appear to breathe. Phase 2. 4 to 6 months. Minimum. I'm going to need a contract. A real one with a salary line, a tax form, and a proper title. I'm going to need a key to the side door I actually use, which I already have, and I'm going to need permission to bring Mr. Biscuit into the library, which I have not yet asked for. And I am going to need... She paused. She took a breath. She looked at him directly. I am going to need you, she said, to keep staring at me across the dinner table. For now. Until I tell you to stop. Which I am not going to do tonight. Adrian Hawthorne, billionaire, heir, employer of her father, owner of the table she was leaning on, the library she was standing in, the house she had walked into 12 nights earlier in a navy blue consignment dress with a coffee stain on the cuff, took 2 steps into the room, stopped, and put his hand flat on the back of a leather chair as though he, too, suddenly required something to lean on. Sienna. Yes, you are certain. I am certain. You do not have to be certain today. I know, she said. I'm certain anyway. He closed his eyes. It was a very small, very quiet thing, the closing of his eyes, and she understood, watching him do it, that she had just handed him something he had been holding in reserve for 3 years. He opened them. He crossed the room. He stopped exactly 1 step away from her, which was, she had come to understand, his particular form of restraint, and he did not move any closer, because he was not going to, because he had not, in 12 days, ever once moved closer than she had asked him to. So Sienna closed the last step herself. She set the legal pad on the table. She put her hand on the front of his soft, dark sweater, very gently, just over his heart, and she felt, under her palm, the steady, quick, slightly unsteady pulse of a man who had finally, after a very long time, stopped pretending. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said. And in the doorway of the library, in the long pale morning light coming through the leaded glass windows, Marcus Vale, 26 years of father, 23 years of bodyguard, and approximately 4 steps too late to do anything about it, paused with his radio earpiece in his hand and his uniform jacket buttoned, and he watched his daughter put her hand over the heart of the man he had spent 23 years protecting, and he did what any father in his position would do, which was to take 1 quiet, careful step backward and close the library door, and walk away down the corridor lined with disapproving oil portraits, because some doors in some houses were not meant to be guarded. They were meant to be left, very gently, to the people inside them. And outside the leaded glass windows, the sun climbed higher over the eastern hills, and the late roses bloomed stubbornly along the walls of the garden and the candles in the dining room, which a member of staff had quietly relit at 6 o'clock that morning out of habit, burned slowly and patiently down, 12 of them in a row, even though there were now, and would be from this morning forward, only 2 people in the room who needed them.